How effective is existing international law on transboundary movements of hazardous waste, and why are data on illicit transboundary movements of hazardous waste difficult to obtain? The case of international transportation of hazardous waste. In 1988, Europe and the United States shipped 3,800 tons of waste to Nigeria through an Italian trader, while the Nigerian government received $100 per month for storage. However, when many residents in Nigeria suddenly began to get sick, the Nigerian government began an investigation and found that hazardous waste had been tampered with and labeled as ordinary waste. Eventually, part of the hazardous waste was shipped back to Italy. The people involved in the waste cleanup at that time were suffering from different illnesses such as nausea, dizziness, and partial paralysis. What is hazardous waste? The Basel Convention definition of hazardous waste covers the following characters: toxic, poisonous, explosive, corrosive, flammable, ecotoxic, and infectious waste. What are the threats of hazardous waste? In addition to causing harm to people, hazardous waste can also cause air, water, and soil pollution because the chemical components of hazardous waste can enter the soil and contaminate the air or rivers when it is not properly disposed of, thus causing harm to the ecosystem. Why are data on illicit transboundary movements of hazardous waste difficult to obtain? In some studies on illicit transboundary movements of hazardous waste, authors have pointed out that obtaining data on illicit cross-border hazardous waste worldwide remain difficult. In part, this is caused by the lack of proper data collection in some countries around the world and thus cannot be elaborated. But another layer may relate to the issue of global environmental governance, as individual countries want to maintain their positive image and reputation in terms of environmental protection. Although countries have been obliged to submit information on their exports of hazardous waste since Basel Convention came into force after 1992, data on illegal cross-border shipments of hazardous waste is still difficult to obtain, according to a 2019 World Customs Organization report. For example, the main limitation of the Basel Convention database is the uneven national reporting practice across countries and years. Industrialized countries, particularly EU countries, generally comply with the national reporting requirement, but the United States, the biggest industrialized country, is not a party to the Basel Convention and does not submit national reports. Many developing countries submit national reports at various frequencies, but some large ones, such as India and China, often only report waste generation instead of traded volumes. For example, this data set obtained from statistics, and strangely, the amount of hazardous waste imported is largely greater than the amount of exported. So it is not clear from which countries the excess hazardous waste is imported, and the data does not give the destination countries of hazardous waste. As seen comment on the dumping of waste from developed to developing countries, offending developed countries must be called to task for hiding behind the environmentalist credentials while secretly taking advantage of weak governance in developing nations to spirit away their environmental misdemeanors. So where do most of this hazardous waste come from, and in the end exported to which countries? A study states that hazardous waste is mainly generated in industrially developed countries, and the cross-border trade of hazardous waste is mainly from developed to developing countries, such as China, India, Pakistan, and African countries. However, currently in the EU, the transport of hazardous waste is mainly concentrated within the EU. Why do developed countries with advanced technology transfer hazardous waste to developing countries? Previous studies by scholars have found that developing countries sacrifice the environment for economic benefits. This involves the poverty, corruption, etc. Besides, the cost of disposing of hazardous waste in developed countries is much higher than exporting hazardous waste directly to developing countries. For example, the cost of disposing of 1 ton of hazardous waste in developed countries is $3,000, while the cost in developing countries is only $2.5 per ton. This huge price differences is the biggest driving force for exporting waste from developed countries to developing countries. The chart above shows the top 3 producers of hazardous waste are Russia, the US, and Germany. Environmental governance. An important factor in the Nigerian case was the corruption. Nigerian government officials were told in advance that the waste being transported was hazardous, but still agreed to receive it. A Nigerian newspaper also reported on this issue but received a warning from the local police to stop writing about hazardous waste. In addition, the lack of technology and knowledge to access hazardous waste in Nigeria also led the belief that this hazardous waste would be found once buried in the soil. Interpol plays an important role in the environmental governance regarding hazardous waste. They mainly cooperate with dumping destination countries to investigate and collect evidence on hazardous waste. But in other cases of hazardous waste dumping in Nigeria, government corruption and inaction have been the main reasons why hazardous waste continues to enter the country. The Nigerian government claims to inspect the waste only when notified by Interpol. It is noteworthy that the Basel Convention has not failed. It is still an important legal basis in environmental governance, but it has corresponding loopholes. For example, although the exporting and importing countries need to agree to accept the content of the waste before they can be transported to the importing country. However, the information is not always accurate. In some cases, the exporting countries of waste interpret with the labeling information, properties of waste, or there is even fraud or bribery of officials in the importing countries of waste. Challenges. The laxity of the Basel Convention can also lead to difficulties in its judicial implementation. The division of responsibilities also shows practical difficulties. For example, the 5 natural persons in the cross-border transport of hazardous waste are generator, exporter, carrier, importer, and disposer. The difficulty arises because in practice it is challenging to separate these 5 actors. Besides, when countries intentionally cancel data on the cross-border trade of hazardous waste, this is very detrimental to environmental governance because accurate data are not available for analysis and for identifying the right solutions. Solutions. The Basel Convention should be improved. The global environmental governance process and cooperation should be strengthened. Especially, superpower like the US should play a role in environmental protection. Data transmission and assurance center mechanism should be established. The media should also play a monitoring role to provide in-depth and follow-up reports on global cross-border hazardous waste. NGOs should be more actively involved in the process of cross-border hazardous waste trade.